The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In this debate, much has been made of the fact that electricity prices increased by, including inflation, 72% over the past decade or so. And the national government's tried to make that out as being the fault of the Labour Party. Well, if that was the case, Mr. Who was it that said that? Mr. Bennett, I think. Why haven't you been able to reverse it? Why haven't you been able to reverse it? Well, because the reality is that we all know in this House, that the main driver of the increase in price in electricity was actually that Maui gas ran out. Oh, rubbish, says Mr. Bennett. Well, actually, that's ill-informed, Mr. Bennett. That is the reality. Maui gas ran out, and alternative sources to replace Maui gas, they gas sources or renewables, were more expensive. And under the marginal cost competitive model that we have for electricity, that is the most significant cause of increase of price of electricity in the last decade. So don't give me this rubbish that it was some sort of mistake by the Labour Party that led to that, because that was the main cause. And were that not the case, were there some other cause, then the National Party would have put our electricity prices down. But they haven't. They've actually left them where they are because they know that that was unavoidable. Mr. Speaker, this legislation in respect of the changing of the name of the Electricity Commission to the Electricity Authority it doesn't change a lot. You know, it makes a few changes. You can argue whether those changes are good or bad, but actually that was just Jerry Brownlee saying that he had to change something, and so he did away with one regulator and he's created another. He did away with one regulator and he's created another. And we've heard from the prior speaker that the objectives have been changed slightly, but really they haven't been changed a lot. And so that's not the most offensive part of this legislation, except that it's a ruse. It actually won't change much in terms of competitive pressures in the electricity market. It's a ruse, and to that extent it's offensive. But what is more offensive than this legislation is the asset swap that is being forced upon Meridian Energy, because that is trying to pursue an improved market competitive outcome at the expense of resource efficiency. And if the market is so uncompetitive that we've actually got to use the physical resource less efficiently in order to get a more efficient financial market outcome, you've got to say that the market model is fundamentally broken. If to obtain a market competitive price efficiency you have to use the underlying physical resource less efficiently, then it's wrong. And we heard this from the warnings from Treasury, from the Technical Advisory Group and from market analysts, that you don't want to use the water in the Waitaki system anything less than as efficiently as you can use it. If you use it less efficiently, you spill some of it, so it doesn't, or you spill more of it, so you don't use as much of it for electricity and it flows out to sea. And if that happens, what do you do when you would otherwise have been using that water that would not have been spilled for electricity generation? The reality is you need more electricity generation to replace the generation that would have come from that water that you've wasted. So pursuing a market efficiency outcome through less efficient use of the water is nonsensical. And that is the greatest flaw of this bill, because forcing Tekapo to be sold to Genesis, or given to Genesis in an asset swap, means that that water, instead of flowing through Tekapo, the Ohau system, Pukaki, the Ohau system, Benmore, Avimore, the Waitaki system, in the ownership of one controller, is the most efficient way to use that resource. And that is just common sense. You split that between different owners who've got different imperatives, and you will end up with less resource efficiency. Not only that, you're going to need different sets of engineers. You're going to have engineers there for Genesis, and you're going to have engineers down there for Meridian. How's that sensible? Two sets of people servicing these sets of dams on the Waitaki. It is nonsensical. Mr. Speaker, resource inefficiency, or the less efficient use of those resources, can only have one consequence, which is to mean that you've got to have extra generating capacity to make up for it, and that comes at the cost of the consumer. I'll say two other things. One of them is a thank you to the government. I agree with the move that is being made here in respect of requiring or allowing penalties to be put upon generators and retailers in the case of a conservation campaign being needed amongst retail customers. And I thank Jerry Brownlee for seeing that through, because I think that's something that when I was Minister of Energy I thought needed to be done, because last time we had a water shortage it's all too easy for the generators to say, oh look, those residential consumers can suck it. They can actually have a conservation campaign, and they're the ones that effectively suffer the cost of the generators not having enough generating capacity or not having stored water early enough in the season. And it's appropriate that there be a financial penalty there for those generators in that situation so as to discourage them from doing it. So I congratulate them on that. But, you know, the big issue that remains in New Zealand is the question as to whether we do have true competition in the electricity market. Because if we don't, we have price gouging. In the absence of competition, markets with monopoly characteristics act as monopolies are reputed to act. They extract monopoly rents. They extract monopoly rents at the expense of consumers. And the issue that Brendan Burns raised is the issue that I was never convinced on as Minister of Energy. We've seen a 72% increase during the period that the national members have quoted in retail tariffs, and during the same period industrial and commercial tariffs, especially industrial tariffs, have not moved nearly as much. And we're now in the position in New Zealand that the gap between tariffs paid by industrial users and residential tariffs is higher than anywhere else in the world. And there has never been an adequate explanation as to why that is justified. And I suggest to the House that it's because at the industrial level, on those big power companies, there is those big power consumers, there is a bit of competitive pressure. But at the retail end of the market, there is not adequate competition. And that's why we've seen these higher increases in respect of retail tariffs than in respect of the industrial tariffs. The government does nothing about that in this legislation, and why don't they? Well, the answer is because they want the dividends. They want the dividends from the electricity SOEs. It suits their purpose for those profits to stay high so that they can gather the dividends. They've had tax cuts that increase the deficit of New Zealand. They've had tax cuts that increase the deficit of New Zealand. And how are they going to fund it? Well, in the future, they're going to fund it in part by these dividends that they want from the major electricity SOEs, and perhaps, we don't yet know their plans, but perhaps through the sale of those electricity SOEs. And of course they know that if the profits of those electricity SOEs are maximised in the meantime, they'll get a higher price when they flog them off. The government has been very careful to say that they will not sell any SOEs during their first term of government. That's their mantra. Their first term of government. If they get a second term, they're not promising that they won't sell them. They're not promising they won't sell them. They've now backed away from under pressure and after all their flip-flops on Kiwibank and New Zealand Post, but they've made no promises in respect of these electricity SOEs, which really in some ways are the crown jewels of the SOEs. They're already owned by New Zealanders. They ought not to be flogged off, but the government is keeping an eye on that option by maintaining their profits higher than they should legitimately be, because there really is not adequate competition at retail. So rather than complaining to us about the electricity price increases, Mr. Bennett, you should be asking yourself why you've done nothing to reverse it, why you've done nothing to reverse it, and why you've done nothing to address the differential between retail and industrial tariffs, and why, in the name of a market efficiency, you are using the underlying resource that you use to generate the electricity less efficiently, because that in the end can only have one consequence, and that is a need for extra generation that has to be paid for the consumers of electricity. The Labour Party opposes this bill.
Members, the question is that the electricity industry